Yeah. So if, my belief system, if you could call it that, which I think you can call atheism a belief system. Um, we, this is like actually a very deep conversation and difficult to untangle looking back at my time as an atheist, because atheism sort of stole a lot of religious tenets from Christianity, right? Atheism only worked because we kind of inherited the morality of Christianity. We could say we're atheists, and someone might say, well, then how do you distinguish between right and wrong? And we're like, well, of course we know how to distinguish between right and wrong, as if we came up with morality. Like, no, this was all already kind of handed to the rational atheist movement, this Christian morality. And so, in a way, you could kind of do some mental gymnastics in your mind to convince yourself like your belief system was not only right but morally superior because of all of these things that the media had told us about Christianity and the church and all these sort of negative connotations to Christianity. You kind of could walk around with like this air of superiority as long as you didn't really examine those deep questions. And I didn't. Right. So to answer your question, that was a trick. You just don't think about it. And I think as you get older, your ability to just ignore those big questions diminishes, especially after having kids. And you start going like, yeah, what is the meaning of this? And how do I really know what's right and what's wrong? And why is there something rather than nothing? Those those aren't questions that any atheist can deal with directly. They have like little strategies for just like swatting those questions away. But even Christopher Hitchens said that those are the questions that gave him pause. You know, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe appear to be finely tuned for life? And so to hear that from someone like him, who's made his whole life out of trying to debate Christians and all religious people, I think those are the questions that get you, and rightly so. But how did I deal with them before I became a Christian? I just didn't, I guess, would be the answer.
You just didn't address them. You were more just curious about
I
your
just
own.
I tried to ignore them, right? And
Uh,
you try to come up with like quick little explanations if someone challenges you on those types of questions, but um, they're typically snide and critical. Like, you know, why does the universe appear finely tuned for life? Well, that's just because you happen to be in the part of the universe where life exists, and the universe is huge, and most of the universe isn't finely tuned for life. And so this is just this form of bias that you as a simple-minded believer have, and that's not right. When you start digging into it actually, you you have to make a lot of assumptions and a lot of faith-based arguments to be an atheist. And so that's something that I've heard many people say before.
yeah, and you said at the beginning of that prior answer too that, or you made the contention that atheism is a belief system of sorts. Oftentimes today you'll hear, "I just merely lack a belief in God.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't. I don't have to prove anything. The onus of proof or the burden of proof is on your side. You who believe in
That's
God."
it. That
So
is the everything hangs on that little argument, is where's the burden of proof? And I've used that line many times as an atheist, and it's completely ineffective. You know, you can't you can't make the claim that all matter in the universe exploded out of a single pinprick at the center of the universe, and that as this matter is spiraling out of control through the universe, complexity emerges. First of all, it violates the second law of thermodynamics, but just put that aside for a second. Complexity emerges, and consciousness emerges, and subjective human experience emerges. And I don't need to explain that, right? All I have to do is say you're wrong for your explanation. That's, of course, ridiculous. And it's not scientific either. Scientists should have said, yeah, that's a great question. And we don't have an answer, and we should be willing to explore these ideas. And they did. You know, early scientists were like that. Scientists of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and even the early 20th century, they acted like that. It's only very recently that science became this worldview. an alternative to God.
So you were beginning to question perhaps the limitations of the form or of science, scientism, or a more reductionistic view of science, and its inability to answer these bigger questions.
Yeah.
So walk us through that and talk with us about how that started opening you to other possibilities and what that looked like.
Yeah. Well, I started to feel like a hypocrite. And if there was something that always for some reason bothered me, even as a kid, it was hypocrisy, right? And and that was one of the amazing things about reading the New Testament for the first time. Was like, oh, it really bothered Jesus too. Hypocrisy is something that he did not like. And anyway, but before I got there, um, I felt like a hypocrite because I said, I would claim that it's foolish or simple or uh, you're making a lot of assumptions in your arguments, and then the Terence McKenna quote, "Give us a miracle and we'll explain the rest." It's like, give us 100 miracles. We're asking for 100 miracles. We're asking for the Big Bang, which actually was a religious idea. George Lemaitre, a priest, proposed that idea, and Einstein famously argued against it, and all these physicists argued against it. And now it's the bedrock of the scientific explanation of our existence, right? But so that's miracle one. And then miracle two is, how do we get complex systems in a closed universe? This is like a detailed physics thing we don't need to get into, but entropy should increase over time. But look around, like this is a very organized world compared to like the vacuum of space or a black hole or something. Complexity emerges, and that's another miracle in an unguided system. It's not a miracle in a guided system, which is the religious view. And then there's abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is, how did we get life from non-life? And atheists actually have no answer for this. And I always thought they did. I always thought, oh, well, evolution. But evolution only explains how, if you take it at face value, it explains how you get a new species from another species. It doesn't explain how the very first life came from non-life. And you look at the explanations of abiogenesis, and they're kind of absurd. One is panspermia, from the discoverer of DNA, one of the discoverers, which is that microorganisms came to Earth on comets, and that just kicks the can down the road, because where did that life come from? And then the other explanation is that molecules just started bumping into, this is Dawkins' explanation, molecules just started bumping into each other in oceans, and every once in a while, two of them stuck. And from that, we got a system of code that can pass traits down through the generations. And, now we have TikTok. And it just is not, it's a miracle, right? Abiogenesis is very clearly a miracle. So I'm like, okay, to be an atheist, I need to believe in like at least, oh, and then there's fine tuning. So I need to believe in like 4 miracles. Okay. So I said, well, if I'm going to believe in miracles, I should kind of explore some other explanations too. Right. And, you really only have to believe one miracle to be a Christian. And so I got to explore this idea, and I did.